Those of you who are familiar with my Jeep, you know it's the European export that came with a 2.5 turbo diesel engine from the factory. And I've had a lot of questions from guys out there who run that same engine about some of the mods I've done, because obviously I've changed the turbo, the downpipe, amongst other things too, to essentially just to improve the performance of the engine in some way, but also the reliability of the engine. This engine has some major pros and cons. And just next to me here I have a second engine. It's basically the same engine that I have in my vehicle, but the Mark 1. So there's a few slight differences. So this is the 425 OHV, or 2.5 turbo diesel engine. And this can produce about 116 to 118 horsepower and 300 Newton meters of torque at around 2000 RPM. I have one in my Jeep, as you know, and I've taken my Jeep all over the place, and I'm actually pretty hard on this engine. But this one here is a Mark 1 and the one in my Jeep is a Mark 2. There are some distinct differences, predominantly that the fuel pump itself is manually operated by a wire. The cylinder head design is slightly different and the valve cover's different. So there are some distinct differences between this one and the one in my Jeep, which is the newer version of the engine. Newer and improved. Which is a Mark II basically. If you look at the fuel pump, although it is mechanical, it's controlled electronically. So I guess what happened was emissions regulations obviously govern all of these kind of things, and electronics started to be added in. Basically this engine, you know, came in lots of Jeep Cherokee XJs in the UK. In Europe, XJs with this engine in the UK are super cheap. You can pick up one in mint condition with this engine with under 200,000 miles on it for about £1,000. Most people don't see much value in them anymore, and sadly most of them have been scrapped, which is a real shame. But if you do have a look on eBay, you'll see loads of them out there with the 2.5 TD engine for sale, and there is kind of a reason for that, and an air of caution if you're going to buy a Jeep with one of these engines in, and you'll probably understand why by the end of this video. Looking at the top of the engine here, you'll see the head is in 4 pieces. So you have one head, 2 valves per cylinder, and that's where the nickname the four-headed monster came from. And the original heads had a number of problems really. The early Range Rovers actually came with a variation of this engine in, an early one, slightly different turbo and design and stuff and manifolds, but basically the same engine. And they had a lot of recalls due to cylinder heads cracking. Sadly, the original cylinder heads, whatever they were made from, they just couldn't cope with heat. And they'd also go porous as well. And there are a number of other problems that we'll go over in a minute when I start tearing this engine down. But just to top it off as well, the original design also had 1 gasket per head. And interestingly, even though this engine has aftermarket heads, so it's clearly had some work done on it, when I took the cylinder heads off, it had the single gasket for each head. And if you've ever done any work on this engine and you've pulled heads off and you've seen those original gaskets, a lot of the time you'll see exhaust gas blow-by coming out the side of the gaskets and going up the cylinder head. You know, so they were clearly very bad head gaskets, and they were prone to lots of problems, and they were worse than the heads in my opinion. When I rebuilt my engine, I used the multi-layered gasket, and there are 3 different thicknesses. And that gasket basically eliminates head gasket failures going forward into the future. And with the aftermarket heads, clearly they can cope with temperatures much better than the old heads, because I mean, I've had my vehicle for quite a while now. It's pretty damn heavy. And when we were in Norway, we were cruising up real steep inclines, very, very long inclines. If you've ever been to Norway, you'll see that they have very steep gradients, and you're climbing up mountains kind of all the time, you know, and you've got to obviously keep that RPM range up, keep the power up as you go up. And you know, I was getting water temperatures of like 110 degrees C sometimes, you know, when it was like 35 degrees C out in the summer. And God knows what my exhaust gas temperatures would have been then, because I didn't have a gauge at that point, but they must have been pretty high. But I guess that's a testament to the new heads and all the work I do with it today, ploughing through snow, you know, the vehicle on full load all day long, 2000 RPM, low range, no issues. And I rarely see exhaust gas temperatures going above 350 degrees C actually when I'm in those conditions, but it is winter to be fair, which, you know, the temperature of your country makes a big difference too. If you do come to doing a job on the heads with this engine, you can take the heads off and you can measure the liner protrusion and the piston protrusion across the block. get the average and select the correct thickness gasket, and that ensures you get correct compression. They're wet lined as well, so you know the great thing about this engine is you really can just pull everything off of it and replace it. And there's a guy I know in the UK who's got one of these with 550,000 miles on it, still with original heads. He still hasn't got a crack. I'm not sure how he's managed that, but maybe not all of them were bad. I mean, I guess things are manufactured in a lot of different places. One thing I've seen, one issue, is people get the head skimmed, which it tells you not to do in the manufacturer's guidelines when you're rebuilding the engine. If you look at the manual, it says do not skim the heads, because they're then subject to going porous, basically, which you absolutely don't want. But a lot of people were getting the head skimmed, and then they were selecting the thicker gasket, thinking that because they skimmed the head, they needed a thicker gasket, and then they were getting low compression. And when the winter came along and temperatures would drop to like below 5 degrees C in the UK, this thing was smoking like a chimney. And it doesn't really work that way, that the gasket thickness is selected based upon the protrusion of the liners and you know, the protrusion of the piston, not how thick the head is. But you shouldn't really get those heads skimmed anyway. But I think the thing to remember is this is a diesel engine, and it excels at off-road work. This engine doesn't overheat from ploughing through a field all day in a tractor, being strapped on a boat and doing 2,000 RPM and blasting away all day long, or even from me off-roading mine, where I'm ploughing through snow all day long, 2,000 RPM low range. And that's the thing, it's a diesel engine, and that's kind of what it was built to do. I think the issue really with the engine is the fact that they put it in a car. The cars often have inadequate cooling, you know, like smaller radiators and the water pumps and everything else. And in all fairness, the cooling channels in the original heads were flawed as well. And it just wasn't able to cool down properly. And then you got into scenarios where you're on the highway, which is really where the problems start to occur. You're doing high speed, you're going down the highway or the motorway, you approach a gradual incline, and you start powering up that incline for many miles. And then you see that water temperature start to creep up, which really tells you that you've got heat soak issues, or basically just that the cooling system isn't doing its job. And once you fit an exhaust gas temperature gauge and you get into scenarios like that, you really do see huge spikes in EGTs with this engine. And I really think that's what led to the demise of the original cylinder heads and whatever material they were made from. You know, people going along the highway, you know, they're losing power, they put their foot down even more. RPM ranges aren't correct then. You know, they're trying to force diesel into these cylinder heads in you know, to get more power. The turbo isn't spooling fast enough. You know, EGTs spike when that happens. They really do. And you know, and I really think that's where issues start to arise. And maybe with a better cooling system, with a better cylinder head design, the engine wouldn't have had such an awful reputation off the bat. And that's really the issue, really. The terrible reputations aren't fixable. Once they're set in stone, they're set in stone. You can see I've made some changes on mine with the cooling system, and as I say, I push my engine really hard, continuously, when I need flotation on snow with big tyres in various conditions. Snow is very variable. Sometimes of year you want to float, and sometimes of year you need to rev it hard to be able to get momentum in certain situations, and you need to do that for a very long time up long hill climbs and everything else. So I push my engine very hard, and you know, it's taken me all over the place around Europe and, you know, around Scandinavia, loads in varying conditions. And I will say that I have no issues with the reliability of that engine in that vehicle. But anyway, what are the pros of this engine? I think one of the major pros is it's really easy to work on. These old diesel engines are, they're remarkably simple. And this one is pretty easy to maintain and swap parts out on. Okay, so when it's in the engine bay, there are some annoying quirks of the engine. For example, turbo placement and also the starter motor. You literally need to take the motor mount off, jack the engine up, pull the motor mount forward to get the starter motor out. It is a pain in the ass job, and it's only something I'd ever want to do once, but it's a starter motor, so I'll probably have to do it again someday. So that's why I picked up that manifold with the T2 adapter on it, because I have some plans to jig things around a bit in the engine bay, and it'll mean that changing a starter out is actually doable without having to move anything in the engine. But you can see that the engine is mostly mechanical. It's a pretty heavy engine. Everything on it is made of metal. There are, in fact, no plastic components at all on this engine. And some people might see that as a plus. Other people might see that as a negative because it's flipping heavy. But a good plus, I would say, for longevity is the injectors are hydraulic. You can pick up a rebuild kit for these injectors for not much money, take them apart in a vise and do a rebuild on them. And they're fairly easy to maintain. The only thing really is the number one fuel injector. That injector is very expensive, and if it fails, they do not make them anymore. I have a spare, just one. You can rebuild the sensor in it though. There is a tutorial online, and I'm going to say it is hard to do by the looks of it. The engine's gear timed, so that adds a lot of noise, but at the same time, it also brings with it a lot of reliability. There should really be very little to no circumstances of ever opening up the front of the engine and adjusting the timing, unless you had to change a fuel pump or something like that. But interestingly enough, the Chrysler Voyager, model of the Chrysler Voyager, had a version of this engine with a chain. So there is a version of this engine out there with a chain, and it's called the R425 OHV. So it's just slightly different there. I suppose another plus is it's a diesel engine and it has a lot of torque at very low RPM. So you can idle it over rocks and you don't need to give it any gas really, for lack of a better word, any diesel. It'll just clamber over things, you know. They're very torquey, diesels, and if you've driven a diesel Cherokee, you've driven a petrol Cherokee, as I have, you'll see a distinct difference in driving between the two of them under certain conditions, obviously. But the petrol kind of wins hands down over this diesel in being more reliable, and also it has more horsepower, and it's probably better for situations where you need flotation. So, you know, you're going through mud and you don't want to sink, you need to spin those tyres fast, or snow. They can be much the same kind of scenario, really, mud and snow. Sand too, I guess. You know, you need a bit of flotation, you need a lot of power, you need to spin those wheels fast. You know, with the diesel, you can do that, but it prefers to stay around sort of 2,000 to 2,500 RPM, rather than blast up in high RPMs and really spin those tyres all over the place. So, you know, it's just a different style of driving, and you get used to the vehicle you're in, and you make it work for you, and you kind of just learn your own way of doing it. What I will do is I'll start tearing down this engine a little bit and kind of show you some key features on it, and then we can take a look at my engine, and I'll show you some of the changes that I've made. But this is the valve cover. Interestingly enough, you can see it says Jeep Turbo Diesel, so they obviously had some investments into this to want to have that printed on there. The engine has a single cam down in the sump, and it's push rod actuated. So you have these push rods, obviously drop down through the cylinder heads into the block there, and you have these tappets that obviously the push rods engage on, and these engage onto the cam, or onto the camshaft, sorry. And obviously these rocker arms, you know, operate the valves. It's a pretty simple engine. You can see this one being one of the early engines. It actually only has one stud. So it's a slightly different kind of design than the newer engines, which have two M8 studs. This to me looks better personally, but apparently it's worse. And with the old style cylinder heads, one of the major issues that they had was the studs pulling out of the aluminium. So apparently the aluminium heat treat on the original heads was very poor, and the studs would essentially rip their way out of the original aluminium heads. So a lot of people were drilling them and putting helicoils in, because helicoils are actually stronger than thread when you look at the data, and that was fixing the problem. But these are actually not original heads. These are made by a company called AMC, and I use AMC heads in my Jeep as well. They're supposedly much better, and most people who have installed them haven't had any issues with them with overheating or the studs pulling out. When I first bought my Jeep, it had the original cylinder heads on. No cracks, and it ran for a few years actually before I experienced any issues. But interestingly enough, I was driving to my mate's house, and he lives in the forest, and I was coming down the drive, and he said to me, "Bloody hell, I thought it was a Chinook, you know, a Chinook helicopter," because the engine was so loud when I was driving towards his house. And I was like, yeah, it's gotten a lot louder recently. And interestingly enough, at the time, I'd put on a new air intake, a cold air intake, you know, in my naivety, thinking it would make a difference. But I thought, yeah, well, it must be the cold air intake making some noise and making it sound cooler. But what had actually happened, interestingly enough, I might have some photos of the head I took off, but I don't know, I have to dig around. But you can imagine two M8 studs going through this head here. So you have one here and one here, and that hole there is where the valve cover bolts down through. So, you know, essentially you've got three supporting it, which I suppose is a lot better than just one bigger stud. But one of the studs had pulled out of the aluminium, and the other stud was taking the full load. And that stud essentially had broken, so it had moved slightly. And then this Chinook-like noise that I was getting was the result of that stud actually breaking completely. So no studs, and just the valve cover holding these rocker arms in place. So the valves obviously weren't opening and closing correctly, and it was causing a lot of noise coming from somewhere, you know, from the exhaust basically, and the sound of the engine. And on my way home from his house that night, I experienced this huge bang, and the car and the engine just shut down. I opened the bonnet, the valve cover had lifted off. There was oil pouring out everywhere, and steam and everything, because obviously, like, well, it was just steam really from the heat of the oil and everything. But you know, I thought, oh, the engine's totally gone. And a mate of mine was a mechanic at the time, and he drove past me by luck, and we went back to his place, and he looked at it and he was like, oh yeah, you know, I've seen this happen before. He removed one stud, drilled it and helicoiled it and put it back, and tried to get the other one out, and he snapped a torque bit in the stud. So, you know, you got hardened steel then in a stud, and we couldn't get it out. And I thought at that point, you know, I was working pretty hard at the time, and I had a bit of cash on my side, and I was like, I'm just going to redo the top end. So I did a load of research, and I rang the guys over in, I think it's Chichester in the UK, the VM diesel specialists. They gave me a ton of advice, and basically I swapped the heads for the AMC design. And it was those guys who told me that the AMC heads have a slightly better cooling channel, and they do have a better heat treat, and they can take a lot more heat than the original head. You know, which I found interesting, and I don't know whether there's any data to support that. But I think proof of the pudding is me running that thing on all that weight, blasting it up hills, really kicking its ass. You know, it's still going strong, and I don't actually worry about the engine at all anymore, even when I'm deep in the wilderness. So, you know, it gave me good peace of mind. But interestingly enough, these heads here are AMC heads too, as I said. And, you know, yeah, maybe they're better, maybe they're worse. They'd need to be pressure tested really for me to rebuild this engine and not feel like I was wasting my time. But that's just a little bit of a story anyway, and some information on the heads. If you are buying spares for this engine, you'll find the cast parts will fetch the most money. But we'll just take this off here. This is the EGR. So this part here you can actually remove. So you take these two M8s off, these 13 mils. You can pull that EGR valve off, and you can buy a blanking plate that blanks that off, and then you can pop that back on and just hook that straight back up to the intercooler. This also then connects via like a little vacuum pump here, or like a solenoid or something, a little vacuum solenoid, to an emissions control unit next to the ECU. If you disconnect that emissions control unit from the ECU, your vehicle will go into limp mode, and you won't be able to go above 2000 RPM. So what you have to do is just chuck a screw in the rubber hose and block it that came off of here, and leave the emissions control unit attached. And then the EGR pipe gets cut off of the manifold, and if you're like me, you can put an exhaust gas temperature gauge in there, so you can monitor the EGT temps coming out of cylinder 4, which is normally the hottest, and you know, and keep an eye on your engine. But we'll just remove that. You can also take off the coolant gallery. That actually bolts down on top of the cylinder heads. Obviously you'll see a pretty similar thing on most diesels. We can actually take off the intake manifold now, but we have to disconnect this vacuum line that goes to the mechanical fuel pump there with a banjo bolt. I'm just going to put that banjo bolt back in, because you know, I don't want to lose that really. But these things are always coked up with garbage. Oh man, you can see it. You know, just loads of rubbish from the EGR. When I originally rebuilt my engine, I took all these to an engineering company in Thornbury in the UK, and basically got them acid dipped. I acid dipped everything and got them to clean everything out, so when the engine was put back together without the EGR, you wouldn't have all that crap left in there and it could really breathe. And even to this day, when I take it to bits, all the parts are still as clean as a whistle via a little bit of runny oil that's probably getting through because of the turbo, but it's certainly not turning into like this kind of skank you'd put on toast and having the breakfast. But yeah, I mean, the water pump housing you see here is a cast piece, and one of the downsides of it is that it can be damaged really easily. I've actually had a water pump fail on mine and wipe out this whole casting here, and this is actually very difficult to find original. It's in two parts, and you see you've got this back bit here, and then you've got this little front piece here that actually bolts onto the block. This is the bit that often gets cracked and broken, and this can survive. And this piece can be found in a China clone alongside a water pump. You can buy the two parts together, but what I would be very careful of is its dimensions. I had one once, and it was actually set a couple of centimetres out more than the original. And what was happening was it was over tightening my belt, the actual serpentine belt, too much tension on it, and I kept losing water pumps and it kept eating them. I went through about 3 or 4 water pumps at that stage, and the thing that cured it was I bought an original and put it back on my vehicle and never had a water pump go again. Well, I say go again, I haven't had one go yet, and it's been 3.5 years. This copper matrix here is an oil cooler. This is where the filter screws onto. You can see it's loose on mine at the moment. This is a very expensive part to buy. It's cheaper to buy an entire engine second hand and keep it as a spare than it is just to buy this one component. Maybe you get lucky, you go on eBay, you find one from someone who doesn't really know its value, and that's really the value of eBay actually. But I'm telling you, if you can get spares and you want to continue running your vehicle, a spare engine is way better than buying these parts individually. But a lot of people use aftermarket oil coolers for this vehicle. They say that this isn't adequate enough. Obviously you have 2 lines in from the cooling system, and you know that's obviously what's helping you cool down your oil. But one comment was that this system here actually contributes to overheating of the engine because it's not adequate enough, and you get heat soak, and heat soak is obviously always a factor that everybody's trying to eliminate on engines that suffer from overheating. I've seen people rewire these to oil coolers on the front of the vehicle. I've not done that. I've not had really any issues with overheating an oil since I've changed my heads, but you know, maybe it's something to think about. But that really brings me to why I've started this video and stripped this engine down. This engine came with a slightly different turbo and a different downpipe to what I had on my Mark II. The original downpipe on the Mark II is a horrible downpipe. It's basically just a thin piece of metal welded to a flange, and that's bolted on the back of the turbo. And I guess you could argue that's what most downpipes are, but this downpipe that came on this Mark I was a beautifully cast one-piece downpipe with an extremely thick wall on it. But this Mark I engine also came with a different turbocharger. It came with a turbocharger that on paper, when I looked at the specifications on the website, was capable of producing 3 pounds more of boost than my turbocharger. And if you're familiar with the VM diesel, when you get up to about 4,000 RPMs, you are literally looking at around 26 PSI with the engine. So there's not really much room for going any higher with this particular engine in terms of tuning. It's pretty easy to sort of imagine you could blow it up by going too high there with the turbo, and I certainly wouldn't play around with the injectors and pump more fuel in it. I think it's fine the way it is. I think it could just, you know, there's just some minor improvements you can make to it. But I think one of the major improvements I noticed was swapping the turbo and the downpipe over was I obviously had a lot more power. I noticed about a 30% increase in power on my Jeep compared to the old turbo I was running. And I'm sure the downpipe hasn't really little to do with it. It's more the turbo. I run an aftermarket intercooler on mine that I've plumbed differently to the stock intercooler that sits below the bumper in the fan cowl. I obviously had to swap the fan cowl out to a different fan cowl. I've got aluminium pipes that are plumbed in, and obviously that larger turbo. It's only a very slight turbo upgrade though. I mean, £3 more boost. It really is just a very small turbo upgrade. But then sometimes on small diesels like this, a very small turbo upgrade can actually mean a lot more performance and kind of safety as well. So you're not kind of getting too much, you're firing too much air into the engine there and getting too much boost. So it's just a small upgrade really. It's made a big difference on my vehicle. My vehicle used to belch out a lot of black smoke, and that was on full compression as well on all 4 cylinders, so there was no issues there. But putting that turbo on, nothing comes out the exhaust anymore. I guess it's getting a lot more air and maybe it's atomising the fuel better. I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert. But despite that upgrade, I think there's a bit more room for improvement, and maybe not so much in power, but in how the engine bay is organised. And maybe I can shorten the charge pipes a little bit on the intercooler, because the charge pipes are very long, and that's obviously robbing PSI as well. And maybe there's some slight boost leaks and stuff. You know, it really needs to be refined a little bit, and it probably could get more performance out of the engine just by kind of a bit of optimization. You know, not a lot of performance, but a bit more, and you know, I'm happy with that. Really re-gearing it is where the real performance would change, but that's going to come soon. So I looked at other engines, the VM 2.5 turbo diesel engine variations that came in other vehicles, and I found this turbo manifold with a T2 flange on it, an exhaust manifold, and this is off the Chrysler Voyager, and amazingly enough, that is a T2, so it's 40mm, and that is 73mm, which I believe is T2, and that means that you can essentially pick any turbo with a T2 flange on it, or T25, maybe T28, and strap it onto this and essentially start playing around with the setup of the engine. But better yet, you can do a manifold flip, wherever the manifold goes, which is here. Yep. You can do a manifold flip, and you can have the turbo raised up next to the intake manifold, so it's easier to maintain it or swap it out if need be. And then the starter motor is clear of any obstruction, and that can be reached and changed without having to take the motor mounts off, jack the engine up, and basically lose all the skin off your knuckles and swear and go mental, and you know. But I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that's not going to work, because look at the intake manifold, and then you're going to have this big old lump thing right there. I mean, how's a turbo going to fit to that? And you're absolutely right, you cannot have a turbo there. And you've also got the issue with, even if you could make it work, you're going to need to put some sort of armour between the two, maybe because of heat soak and stuff. But this is where another part that I've managed to find is coming. So if we take this manifold off, I have a slightly different manifold I found on another VM diesel engine, and that takes this entry point there, so it's flat all the way along. So you imagine that bit sticking out isn't there, so it looks like that. And then the entry point is at the front, and that was on the Sierra Granada series in the UK. So if you can find a Sierra Granada, I think that's what it's called anyway, I'll put all this in the description. Then the opening for the air intake is at the front, and then the turbo will actually be able to sit alongside the intake manifold, and with some plating between the two, there shouldn't really be too much of an issue. This video is probably going to bring up way more questions than I'm answering, really, from guys out there who follow the channel and have 2.5 turbo diesels who have asked me questions. And I want to say again, I'm not an expert. You know, if you want to talk to an expert, ring the guys in Chichester or wherever they're from in the UK and speak to the VM diesel specialists. You know, those are people who I've called in the past to get information for myself, really. But as I said, my experience is just purely hands-on. But it really isn't as bad an engine as people say it is, and it can be extremely reliable. I know I'll get a lot of questions about the changes I've made to my engine, and as I'm working on it, I promise you I'll show you the mods I've done, and show you also some of the problems with the mods I've done and why I'm now further modifying it again. Because I think there's always room for improvement. I mean, look at the blooming Cherokee, for Christ's sake. I mean, that's a vehicle that was made, and there's tons of room for improvement on it, and that's really what all this is. It's about building a machine, and making that machine kind of how you want it to be, because very few things off the shelf are how I want them to be. I can tell you that, and you've probably guessed that already. But in terms of kind of maintenance, I change the oil once a year. Some people recommend changing it twice a year. I think if you do a lot of miles, if you do 10,000 miles a year, I would change it twice a year. The cylinders in the engine are obviously replaceable, so they're wet lined. So you can basically pull them out and then you can change them. Then you can change the piston rings too at the same time, and you can change the bearings on the camshaft and everything else, and you can, you know, do that pretty easily. It's not a difficult engine to kind of do that sort of work on, especially if it's out of the vehicle like this, obviously. But you don't really need to worry about all of that if you change oil regularly, because oil reduces wear. Having fresh oil in the system, you know, it's going to take all the particulates and all the crap, and it's going to stop it from damaging, and it's going to lubricate the engine. That's what it's there for. So another thing I use is some snake oil, and here it is, Engine Restore. Each process separately, badge not included, no motorbike guarantee. But anyway, Engine Restore is like some snake oil that I pour in the engine when I do an oil change. But it isn't really snake oil. It contains CSL. Basically, CSL is like copper and lead in tiny, tiny particles. And there have been tons of testing with this stuff. And it basically repairs damage in bearings and the cylinder walls and the rings and everything else. And it actually genuinely restores full compression in all cylinders. And this video is not sponsored by Engine Restore. I paid for this, and I pay for it every year. And I use 1 can of this with every oil change once a year. And it's honestly maintained my compression, full compression on all cylinders. And I'll do a video of that to prove it. But I actually really like this stuff. And you know what? A lot of other people do. And there's actually been a ton of money put into the testing of this. And I think if you've got an old engine, you know, this stuff works really well. But I don't know, there's some engines that they say not to use it on, some of the newer stuff. But these old agricultural engines, like these old diesels and big old V8s and stuff like that, this stuff actually works really well. I've seen a few videos of people using it online on Jeeps, and they've been like, don't work. But you have to do around 100 to 150 kilometers after you use it for it to actually start to work. And even then I drive it a bit more. You know, it doesn't work like just after a short drive. You have to do like 100 Ks or like 100 miles or something after you use it, and then it starts to work. But then once you've started using it and you're using it with every oil change, it's like a maintenance dose. And you know, one thing I noticed with it actually is cold starts are a lot better. You know, with the coolant as well, coming back to maintenance, some people have said, you know, you want to change the coolant every year. You don't need to do that. I use a Comma Long Life, and it's got 5 years on it, and I do a 60-40 mix with deionized water. The reason I do that is because that's what the manufacturer recommends. The more coolant, the higher the boiling point. 60-40 is what's recommended, and I've tested that in the garage, and it's minus 55 degrees C freezing point, which obviously works for me here because the lowest temps we get are like minus 38 degrees C. So that coolant works really well, and you know, it lasts for around 5 years. I probably just change my coolant every 5 years. So the stuff I use is that stuff there. So super long life red concentrate antifreeze, mixing it 60-40 with deionized water, and that is 5-year organic additive technology OAT production. You know, and I've been using that really for the last sort of 7 years, and I've not had any issues with overheating. And that really comes back to a bit of the hearsay about the engine. I have a boost gauge, I have an EGT gauge. That EGT gauge is right here by cylinder number 4. Literally as it comes out, it's pre-turbo, so, and it's right by the exit of the cylinder. So it's kind of like giving me as accurate reading as possible, really. And I have never had exhaust gas temperatures over 500 degrees C with this engine. I very ever rarely go above 380 degrees C. The only time I've got to 480, which is the highest I've ever gotten to, was when it was like 33 degrees C outside. It was the summer, it was hot. We were traveling, I had a ton of kit on board, and I was doing a long hill climb for a long time. And it crept up to 485, but it stayed at 485. And coolant temperatures crept up just below 100 degrees C, and they stayed there, and they continued to stay there as I travelled along. And that kind of showed me that things were working, because it's when stuff continues to creep up higher and higher and higher that you've sort of got a problem, really. That you're getting some of the issues with heat soak, or things aren't being cooled down adequately enough. But perhaps the bigger intercooler, and the fact that I've got a snorkel and it's taking air from outside the cab, up high, maybe that has something to do with it. I guess every degree lowered on the intake is a degree lowered on the outtake, they say. I suppose the issues are really going to occur if you're not driving the vehicle correctly. And what I mean by that is small turbocharged diesel engines. None of them like heat. They all have problems. And if you're bogging the engine, if you're engine bogging, you're going to spike your EGTs up, and your turbo's not going to like it. The engine's going to start vibrating, just like that. It'll make that sound. And then you're going to start running into issues with failures and overheating and other parts going eventually. And what I mean by engine bogging is, let's take this scenario. You're in fifth, and you're approaching a hill climb at 85 miles per hour. And it's a really steep incline. Let's say you're in Norway, you've got like 20% gradients and stuff. You hit that hill climb, and you're going along, and your engine's losing power because it essentially can't maintain that speed with whatever you've got going on going up that hill. And you put your foot down more. The turbo, the RPMs, let's say they're like, you're at 1,600 RPM, which isn't high enough, really. The turbo is trying to spool. The engine starts bogging. You're pushing it basically in fifth to try and get more power out of it. It's not going to like it. Maybe that was a crap description, but hopefully you know what I mean. And basically you start hearing the engine vibrate. It starts making a horrible sound. Not like when it's at 2,000 RPM and it's going, and it's just happy. And those temps are stable, the vibrations aren't there, and the engine's happy, and the turbo's able to spool correctly. EGT, the whole exhaust gases are getting sucked out. What you're doing is you're bogging the engine down. The turbo's not spinning fast enough. You're basically overheating the engine, and you're vibrating it a lot. And that's, most of the time, that's when failures are going to occur. You really should change down to fourth in that scenario, and then get your RPMs around 2,000 again. You're at the max torque curve, everything's happy, the turbo's going, whee, up the hill you go. But a lot of people get annoyed, there's no power, this engine's crap, and then sorry, I've been in the car with people like back in the UK who've done that with the same engine, and then like you're getting real. If you have an EGT gauge, what I'm trying to say is, if you actually fit an EGT gauge, you will see all this. You'll see these temp spikes. If you change up to fifth and you're blasting up a hill and you're bogging the engine, you'll start smashing above 550 degrees C. You'll start climbing up near 600, and then you're going to start to see. Maybe you're going to start to see problems. I don't know what this engine can take, but I think 600 is high for this engine, actually. But, I think how you drive the engine is a massive part of it. And the way I've driven my engine for the last 5 to 6 years since I rebuilt it, maybe 5 years, 5.5 years, it might be near 6 years now, because time's just fading away. When you get kids and everything, everything changes. But basically, I've never had any issues with overheating since. And it's the way I think it's the way I drive it. I'm listening to the engine. you know, and if the engine doesn't sound happy, I change up or I change down depending on what I'm hearing. You know, if I'm going up a hill and the engine starts to go, making vibration sounds, and I see those EGT spiking, I change down. And then I'm back at 2000 RPM again, and the engine's happy and the temps stabilise and nothing climbs. You know, it's just about how you drive the vehicle. And I think, to be honest, because it's an older engine and an older vehicle, maybe if you haven't driven a vehicle like that before, you forget that that used to be a thing. Because modern vehicles these days, you don't really need to care about that stuff so much. But with older stuff, you kind of do. You kind of need, you know, you kind of need to keep an eye on that sort of thing, really. You know, Jesus, coughing a lot. Excuse me, I keep coughing. It's because I'm talking too much and I'm still not over my illness yet. But anyway, I hope this video has been helpful. I'm going to end it there because really this is just kind of a tear down of my thoughts about this engine, some of the mods I've done with it, and going forward, what I'm about to do. And maybe it'll just get some of you VM guys interested in what's to come, and maybe you even get to see an engine blow up. I hope not. Anyway, thanks for watching again. Hope you enjoyed this video. Have a look at the links in the description, the information I've provided, and maybe I will see you again in another one. Take care.